Welcome back to another episode of The War Room. In this video we're going to look at two battles from two different wars and see how they impacted the development of infantry tactics in Europe. From the Boer War we're going to examine the Battle of the Tugela Heights, how this pushed tactical development in one direction and led to the British Army changing its training and, for want of a better word, its doctrine. Then we're going to go over to the Battle of the Yalu from the Russo-Japanese War, how that differed from the Boer War battle, and what lessons everyone took away from that one. So we're starting off by going back to South Africa, back to the eastern side of the country at Natal. This is where we were a couple of episodes back, after the battles of Talana Hill and Ellenslacht. The British force, now under General Sir George White, had mounted a third attack on the Boers outside Ladysmith, but suffered a reverse and ended up trapped in the town. The siege of Ladysmith, along with the sieges of Kimberley and Mafeking, led to a more significant British response. We looked at part of this in the last video, focusing on Lord Methuen force on the Cape Columny front as it tried to punch up the railway line to Kimberley. Now we're going back over to Natal, to the larger part of the British relief force under Methuen's commander, General Sir Redvers Buller, as they try and relieve Ladysmith. The entire strategic problem facing the British in Natal was the result of General Penn Simons taking his force into the vulnerable triangle north of the Tugela, something which Buller, having previously fought in South Africa against the Zulus and the Boers themselves in the First Anglo-Boer War, had told him not to do. Then, having been ordered to take command in South Africa in order to sort out the mess, he wasn't allowed to pick his own staff or divisional commanders, and was ordered for political reasons to split his force up and concentrate on relieving the three sieges directly, which was exactly what the Boers wanted. Buller's first attempt led to the Battle of Calenzo on the 15th of December 1899. This is somewhat similar to the Battle of the Modder River. Unable to conduct effective reconnaissance due to Boer marksmen, the British assumed the Boers were dug in on the hilltops overlooking the river crossings when they were, in fact, concealed down by the riverbanks. Ultimately, Buller's attack was derailed by two fiascos. Colonel Long of the Royal Artillery disregarded orders to keep his distance and brought his guns forward into effective rifle range of the Boers, who decimated his gun crews, who spent the rest of the battle pinned down. Then Major General Hart of the Irish Brigade, a keen enthusiast of close order tactics, marched his 4 battalions into a loop in the Tugela, looking for a ford in the wrong place, and they were engaged from 3 sides by Boers in concealed trenches, suffering over 500 casualties. Upon seeing that the battle had developed in this way, Buller immediately called it off, though it took the rest of the day for some elements of the embattled and suppressed British force to extricate themselves. On the 23rd of January 1900, Buller left the railway and moved west, crossing the Tugela and moving on the dominant hilltop of Spion Kop. Attacking on a misty night, the lead British brigade was able to seize the summit with a surprise advance. Unfortunately, the British infantry was not well conditioned to digging in, and the lack of tools and work combined with the rocky soil of the hilltop meant that the single trench they had attempted to dig was too shallow to offer any real protection. Worse, as dawn broke and the mist cleared, the British realised that they had only reached a false summit and their position was overlooked on 3 sides. Even so, if the British managed to secure the high ground and get guns up onto the hill on the next night, the whole Boer defence on the hills around Spion Kop would quickly become untenable. Realising this, the Boers mounted repeated desperate counterattacks. The result was that a vicious fight persisted on top of Spion Kop all day, with the British taking heavy casualties from their exposed position, but the Boers suffering just as much as they discovered how difficult it was to evict troops armed with magazine rifles. The battle became an endurance contest, and by the end of the day, the participants were physically and morally shattered. A late wave of British reinforcements had seized another chunk of high ground on the hill, the Twin Peaks, and as the sun fell, significant elements of the Boer force disengaged in the belief they had lost the battle. But the British had reached their limit too, and as convinced as the Boers that the battle was lost, the survivors fell back down the hill. Waking up in the morning to find the British gone, the Boers could hardly believe it. Buller's third attempt to get across the Tugela and relieve Ladysmith was at Vaal Krantz on the 5th of February. Here, although the British managed to get across the river and secure a foothold on some of the high ground, Buller was hesitant to continue the attack in the face of increasing resistance and a lack of room to bring up and redeploy his artillery on the captured hilltop of Valkrans itself. Calling a council of war with his generals, he decided to retreat after 2 days of fighting. Despite this succession of reverses, Buller and the Natal field force had not suffered a significant defeat. They may have repeatedly failed to move forward, but they remained a credible threat to the Boer investment of Ladysmith, and, more importantly, they had been accumulating valuable experience. The fourth British attempt to get across the Tugela was a much slower and more painstaking process. Switching his attention back to the central Calenzo area, Buller started to unpick the Boer hilltop positions on his side of the river east of the railway. This required a very different mindset than that with which the British had started the war. This was not to be a one-day affair, starting with an artillery bombardment, reaching a crescendo with the infantry assault, and finishing off with the cavalry pursuit. Instead, this was going to be a long slog with close and constant cooperation between infantry and artillery. On the 12th of February 1900, the British took Hussar Hill and quickly established their artillery on the summit. Using this position to support the infantry advance, Green Hill and Singolo fell in succession over the next 3 days, allowing the artillery to spread out and find new angles on Monte Cristo, which was taken on the 18th. From here, the remaining Boers east of the river on Hlangwane were evicted on the 19th. Hlangwane dominated the river crossing and the Boer defensive positions around Calenzo that the Natal field force had failed to breach back in December. Finding those positions now untenable under British guns and placed on the hill, the Boers withdrew, but the path to Ladysmith was still closed. The all-important railway line threaded its way through successive lines of more well-defended copies. Attempting to repeat the unpicking of the Calenzo position, Buller avoided the town itself and floated a pontoon bridge across the river upstream of Hlangwane to attack the Boers' flank. By the 22nd, the British had only managed to gain bloody toeholds on the far side. Win Hill, Horseshoe Hill and Harts Hill all had British troops established on the lower slopes, but Boers firmly entrenched on the summits. Part of the renewed difficulty lay in the terrain, part in the awkwardness of providing effective fire support from the British riverbank. Crossing even further upstream had originally been discarded, with the Tugela narrowing to a gorge and looking unsuitable if not impossible to bridge from a distance and on the poor quality maps available. But now that one bank was secure and scouts and engineers could explore the area in detail, they concluded that they could relocate the pontoon bridge. Leaving his engaged forces in their positions on the lower slopes of the Boer Hills to pin the defenders in place, Buller attacked via this new route on the 27th. Boer trenches atop Peters Hill were suddenly subject to the attentions of newly established British batteries on their side of the river. Following closely behind a walking barrage, the British infantry stormed the hill, before going on to take Railway and Harts Hills with further direct support from the guns, frequently firing right up until the last second before the infantry came in with the bayonet. The Royal Artillery and Royal Navy guns worked in some places to corral the Boers into their trenches with shrapnel shells before smashing them with high explosive. The Boers crumbled and retreated, lifting the siege of Ladysmith, which Buller and the Natal field force relieved the next day. After this, the two British forces advancing in Natal and Cape Colony brushed aside or outmanoeuvred the remnants of the Boer field armies and occupied the capitals of the two republics, Bloemfontein and Pretoria. Some Boer elements refused to concede defeat, however, and kept up an extensive guerrilla campaign for the next 2 years. This naturally resulted in widespread, small-scale actions in which the deficiencies of British Army training were further highlighted. Poor marksmanship, inadequate use of cover, concealment and dispersion, mixed with a lack of initiative, loomed up as significant problems that the British sought to correct after the war finally ended on the 31st of May 1902. Weapons usage, for example, was singled out for improvement after seeing the effectiveness and tactical utility of the Boers' shooting skills. Training and standards were changed to correspond to battlefield experiences. Centralized control by officers who identified targets, determined ranges and controlled fire through volleys was acknowledged to be unrealistic. This kind of direct control required men to be close to their officers, encouraging them to clump up and discouraging the effective use of cover and concealment, while volley fire was clearly ineffective against dispersed targets able to duck behind cover. So individual marksmanship was emphasised. The annual ammunition allotment for each soldier rose to a heady and very expensive 300 rounds, and qualifying to marksman standard was rewarded with increased pay. Although firing at fixed, obvious range targets still had a place, snap shooting was emphasised, with drills featuring time-limited targets popping up at random distances, forcing soldiers to spot them, estimate range, adjust sights, and get shots on target before they disappeared. The culmination of this was the famous Mad Minute, introduced in 1909, which further emphasised realistic shooting conditions. The shooter was in the prone position with only 5 out of 10 rounds in his rifle. He was only allowed to reload with 5-round stripper clips taken from his bandolier or pouches. The target was 300 yards away, with the centre scoring area roughly corresponding to the size and shape of a head and upper torso firing from a trench. With only a minute and 15 rounds in such conditions, the Mad Minute was clearly a drill designed to generate a significant amount of aimed rifle fire in a short amount of time. The kind of torrential effective fire that would, for example, stop an enemy bayonet charge dead in its tracks. But while the British Army focused on the tactical lessons learnt, the Continental powers looked on the Boer War from a different perspective. For Great Britain at the start of the 20th century, land warfare came in 2 flavours: colonial expansion and colonial policing. These 2 tasks did not require a large army and generally produced a small number of casualties. The much higher losses of the Boer War, magnified by the small size of the army, were a significant driver behind tactical development. For the Germans and the French, on the other hand, the main focus of warfare was large-scale great power conflict with each other. This kind of warfare, with huge armies fighting for national survival, was always going to result in a much greater body count, and the 2 armies were far more tolerant of casualties. And there were certainly examples of Boer War battles where the victor was the side that toughed it out. At Modder River, for example, it was the Boers who quit the field, while at Spion Kop it was the British, both sides handing victory to their opponents by default simply because they felt they had suffered losses that, while heavy by Boer or British standards, were not significant in the view of the French or the Germans. Furthermore, a lot of the tactical problems faced by the British were unique to the terrain of South Africa and their opponents in the Boer commandos. The Franco-German border did not have the vast open spaces, long sightlines and clear atmospheric conditions that allowed the Boers to put down rifle fire at extreme ranges. It didn't take much to see that the effectiveness of Boer marksmanship and its attendant ability to stop advancing British battalions in their tracks would have been significantly reduced in the farmland of Alsace and Lorraine, with its rolling hills, hedges, woods and villages. Furthermore, the resultant British emphasis on dispersion raised some obvious problems. Spreading out soldiers might decrease casualties, but it also decreased firepower. Thinking in terms of rifles per metre, it's logical that the side with a greater density of riflemen will come out on top, especially when you factor in the fact that every casualty the smaller party takes decreases their firepower by a greater fraction and increases the larger party's advantage. Concentrating on the bayonet as the final arbiter of combat, as almost everyone did up until the First World War, the other uncomfortable question was how to stop a bayonet charge with a handful of rifles. The British might point to the repeated instances of this happening in South Africa, but the Continentals might equally point out that there were not only no Boer marksmen in Europe, but plenty of French and German infantrymen propelled forward with the intimidating offensive spirit needed to close with the enemy. More issues with the British campaign lay above the tactical level. A great many British failures were, for example, rooted not only in poor force reconnaissance, in an inability to correctly locate Boer positions, but poor ground reconnaissance. At Calenzo, the Irish brigade marched into a fire sack looking for a ford in the wrong place. At Spion Kop, the night attack stopped on what it incorrectly thought was the summit of the hill. These issues were part and parcel of conducting loosely planned operations in undeveloped, poorly mapped colonial backwaters, compounded by an enemy with an uncanny ability to shoot any scouts before they saw anything useful. Both the French and the Germans, by comparison, had not only an excellent understanding of the terrain they anticipated fighting over, what with it being the battleground of Europe for centuries, but they had decades worth of minutely detailed planning to back them up. The staff work and planning behind Methuen's advance towards Kimberley is a pale shadow of the gargantuan German Schlieffen Plan or the French Plan 17. In fact, a lot of British failures in the Boer War can be adequately explained without referring to tactics at all, and a lot of British successes in the latter part of the conventional campaign can be explained away as the result of actually engaging with the conflict seriously. Buller's replacement as Commander British Forces South Africa, Field Marshal Lord Roberts, brought 100,000 reinforcements with him and proceeded to use them as a blunt instrument on the Cape Colony front. He relieved Kimberley by the simple expedients of sending his massed cavalry around the Boer positions, and he forced the surrender of 5,000 Boers under Piet Cronje at Paardeberg by surrounding them and battering them into submission with his massed artillery. The simple argument that the British won once they actually applied themselves to the war on a continental scale instead of trying to scrape through on the cheap with the bare minimum is not entirely untrue. All that said, the Boer War did turn some heads on the continent, and for a few years so-called war tactics in line with the British Army's tactical reforms were in vogue, as armies frantically grasped at lessons learnt from a modern battlefield. And when 1904 rolled around and the Japanese declared war on the Russians in Manchuria, all eyes turned on that conflict too. The Russo-Japanese War was seen as much more relevant than the Boer War. The Russians were of course an established European power, and the up-and-coming Japanese Imperial Army had been closely modelled on and trained to European standards, complete with European advisors. During Japan's crash modernisation after 1866, they had favoured the French army. After the French army lost the Franco-Prussian War, the Japanese switched to the Germans, who would beat them. Seeking to secure its home islands from the possibility of a Western invasion via Chinese-controlled Korea, the Japanese successfully overturned Chinese regional influence in the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95, justifying their switch to a Western-styled army and navy. Japanese terms at the end of the conflict saw Korea removed from Chinese influence completely and granted independence, with that independence and clear Japanese influence maintained, amongst other things, by the Japanese annexation of the Liaodong Peninsula in southern Manchuria. Unfortunately for the Japanese, this was an area that the Russian Empire was very interested in, specifically the peninsula's warm water port at Port Arthur to complement Vladivostok, which was ice-locked during the winter. Unwilling to tolerate Japanese encroachment and aiming to take advantage of Chinese inability to stop the Western powers doing anything they wanted to it, Russia gained the diplomatic support of France and Germany to intervene in the war's aftermath. With support from the British Empire and the Americans non-forthcoming, and the Japanese unwilling to contemplate further hostilities against much superior opponents, they accepted financial compensation in exchange for abandoning their southern Manchurian buffer zone. As a result, they were somewhat upset when the Russians moved in and took the area for themselves, invalidating all the work Japan had just done to remove the threat posed by a vulnerable Korea, with the added insult of duplicitous diplomacy. The Russians proceeded to manifest exactly the danger the Japanese had worried about, fortifying Port Arthur and exerting a clear strategic threat by extending a branch of the Trans-Siberian Railway into Manchuria, while demanding a neutral zone in North Korea that they promptly started expanding their interests into. By 1904, Japan had given up trying to negotiate with the Russians and, this time secure against foreign intervention by diplomacy of its own, including an alliance with Great Britain, it set out to remove the Russian threat in Manchuria, which would coincidentally leave the area open to Japan's own expansionist aims in the future. After a sharp series of naval victories that saw the Russians' Port Arthur squadron penned in harbour, including a surprise torpedo boat attack delivered simultaneously with a formal declaration of war, the Japanese Navy had secured the command of the sea necessary for the Japanese army to start transferring forces to northern Korea. By the 21st of April, the Japanese First Army under General Kuroki Tamamoto was poised on the southern bank of the Yalu River with 34,000 men and 128 guns, facing off against the eastern detachment of the Russian Manchurian Army, under Lieutenant General Mikhail Zulich, who had 19,000 men and 62 guns at his disposal. The ensuing Battle of the Yalu was very similar in situation to the Battle of the Tugela Heights. Both Buller and Kuroki were faced with the prospect of forcing a contested river crossing in difficult terrain. The Yalu at this point is wide and broken up by long sandy islands, with several smaller tributary rivers feeding into it from the mountains and hills along each bank. The Japanese army was based in and around the village of Uiju, but they had made sure to conceal important routes with millet screens and trees, and maintained activity on a 40-kilometre stretch of the riverbank to keep the Russians guessing about their intentions. For their part, the Russians set up on the hills along the river, digging trenches and artillery positions, but didn't attempt any significant reconnaissance to get an advance warning of any Japanese attack. Having thus encouraged the Russians to spread their defence out over a wide area, concealed his true intent, and gathered significant information about Russian dispositions via Japanese scouts masquerading as local Korean fishermen, and the fact that the Russians had neglected to conceal any of their positions, Kuroki began his attack on the night of the 25th of April by seizing the islands of Kintai and Kyuri. The small Russian outposts on these islands were quickly overwhelmed and disengaged. The next day, light Japanese naval forces steamed into the Yalu Delta and proceeded upstream to Antung, where they bombarded the defending Russian forces. This was another exercise in deception. Antung was where the Japanese had crossed the Yalu fighting against the Chinese 10 years earlier, and it helped suggest to the Russians that the actions the night before were merely a feint. Zulich's suspicions about how the battle was going to develop were maintained, and he kept his reserves on his right flank around Antung. The 26th of April saw Kuroki's engineers start work building a long trestle bridge across the river between the villages of Uiju and Chuliancheng. This attracted the fire of the Russian batteries on the opposite bank, revealing their precise locations to the Japanese. On the night of the 29th, the Japanese 12th Division crossed the river in the northeast, easily brushing aside the thin Russian defence and swinging southwest towards Zulich's left flank. On the same day, Japanese probes towards Moore Island in the centre attracted the attention of the Russian artillery, which was swiftly and brutally silenced by effective counter-battery fire. Not only had the Japanese plotted the locations of the Russian batteries previously, but they had made sure to conceal their own artillery and, using observers communicating via field telephones, engaged in indirect fire that made it very difficult for the Russians to return the favour. The next night saw the 2nd and Guards divisions cross in the centre, linking up with the flank of the 12th Division and moving to assault the Russian positions ahead of them at dawn. Advancing across the Ai and towards Chuliancheng, with their artillery support suppressing and neutralising the Russian guns, Japanese attack columns eventually came under fire from Russian riflemen occupying trenches on the hillsides. The Japanese battalions were attacking in close order behind their colours, in line with the Prussian practice of the day, and the Russians waiting for them had the advantage of trenches and excellent fields of fire across the Yalu. The Russians were not the Boers though, and despite suffering heavy casualties from incoming volleys in certain places, the Japanese were able to maintain their advance. Although they made use of cover and extended their order, Kuroki's columns also had concentrated artillery support, weight of numbers, and sheer determination on their side, eventually closing with the Russian trenches and clearing them out with the bayonet. At the end of the day, the Russian line was comprehensively broken, and the scattered surviving elements of Zulich's left flank were engaged in a fighting retreat back to the village of Homantang, soon joined by the rest of the Eastern Detachment, which had spent most of the battle effectively neutralised by the effective Japanese deception operation. That's a necessarily pretty brief overview of the Battle of the Yalu to go with our pretty brief overview of the Battle of the Tugela Heights. Getting down in the dirt to look at the tactics is somewhat difficult given the Russo-Japanese War is just as obscure as the Boer War, but with the added issue of being fought between two non-English speaking nations. But it seems pretty clear that the Japanese attacking over the Yalu didn't run into the same kinds of tactical problems that the British did crossing the Tugela. British military observers present, like Sir Ian Hamilton, who fought at Ellenslacht, might be scathing of Russian entrenchment skills and marksmanship, commenting with good reason that the Japanese attack would never have worked against well-trained marksmen firing from well-concealed positions. But the overall impression of the battle is that Kuroki's success was at what we would probably call today the operational level. This is in keeping with the Continental emphasis at the time on large-scale warfare. Small unit tactical problems like how to advance in the face of magazine rifle fire weren't a massive concern because they were lost in the size of battles. If one battalion got bogged down, there would be more to either side still able to advance and outflank the offending enemy position. If the infantry ran into significant trouble, the artillery was there to support it. If a battalion had to suffer heavy casualties to storm some critical terrain or punch a hole in the enemy line, then it was better to take it on the chin and push through to gain operational level effects the rest of the army could exploit, than it was for the battalion to go to ground and stay alive. Furthermore, the Japanese use of deception, night movements, concealment, and most importantly in-depth reconnaissance and planning allowed them to concentrate overwhelming force against a weak area of the Russian line on the Yalu in a way that the British struggled to do on the Tugela. By way of comparison, it's easy to see why the British struggled with their river crossing. The Natal field force was stronger than the Boers, but not strong enough to both pin a substantial amount of defenders in place while the main body attacked elsewhere like Kuroki's First Army could. This, combined with poor reconnaissance, haphazard planning, and the asymmetry between foot-mobile British infantry and mounted Boer commandos, ensured that whenever the British tried another approach like at Spion-Kop and Wahlkranz, they found the Boers there waiting for them. The Japanese, on the other hand, were facing a lethargic Russian force focused exactly where the Japanese wanted them to focus. In fact, Buller's ultimate success in the Battle of the Tugela Heights bears more than a passing resemblance to Kuroki's success on the Yalu. Both sides pinned the main enemy force in place, albeit via different methods, and then they crossed the river obstacle elsewhere and descended on the defender's flank. Arguably, the British problem was finding the right terrain to allow them to exercise their strength. Terrain where the battlefield wasn't restricted to such a small scale that the Boer tactical advantage was dominant, something that the Japanese had been able to do in advance, thanks to more effective reconnaissance and, in true Prussian-German style, planning, and more planning with an extra side of planning, with planning on top. In other words, on several levels and bolstered by the experiences of the Russo-Japanese War, it was possible for continental armies to explain away the tactical problems encountered by the British in the Boer War. The conflict did not reflect the wars they saw themselves fighting, the Boers did not reflect the opposition they expected to face, and hot on the heels of that conflict came the Russo-Japanese War, where conditions were not only more in line with their expectations, but the Japanese ultimately prevailed using contemporary German methods. At the same time, though, the sheer size of the French and German armies made it very difficult for them to change their small unit tactics and individual training, even had they wanted to. In 1914, the British Army had an active regular strength of about 250,000 long-service professionals. This was enough to present some serious training issues. The allotment of 300 rounds per soldier per year for marksmanship for training, for example, translates into 75 million rounds a year. Such an expense that they reduced it to 250 pretty quickly. But at least the British Army was relatively small, and men signing on for 7 years of service had enough time to be trained effectively. To the French, with a combined regular and reserve of 4 million men, or the Germans with 4.5 million, dramatic changes in training and doctrine were several orders of magnitude more difficult. Soldiers were conscripted for 2 or 3 years, about long enough for a national serviceman to be imbued with military discipline and taught to march and fire his weapon in generally the right direction. So training needed to be short, simple, and effective to not only generate large numbers of useful soldiers quickly, but to drum the basics into even the most backwards or recalcitrant conscript whether they wanted to learn or not. Complex notions of range estimation, use of cover and concealment, and small-scale tactical decision-making were best left to the Selective Officer Corps, which had more time for training and more reliable capacity to be trained. On top of that, after his national service, a conscript went back to civilian life. From here on out, for the next 20 years or so, he was part of the reserves, with decreasing time allotted for refresher training and annual manoeuvres. Making any significant changes to the way this kind of army fought would require retraining all of the reservists too, or risk having a two-tier army, and there simply wasn't enough time or money available. So if tactical change was necessary, they would have to be small and incremental. not to mention cheap and certain to be effective. For the Continental powers, focused as they were on operational level effects, mass and speed, the last thing they needed was to chase down every passing tactical fashion. While the British experience of the Boer War raised some important issues with regards to the new magazine rifle swept battlefield, these could be explained away, were thrown into doubt by the Russo-Japanese War, and in any case would be difficult to address. The result was that while the British Army underwent tactical reform in the run-up to World War I, nobody else did. It would take mass, universal experience amongst the European powers for the new tactical environment to be recognised and adapted to, and unfortunately, they're all about to get it. In the next video of the War Room, I think we're going to take a look at the Battle of Mons, where the British Expeditionary Force clashed with the German First Army in August 1914, and German close order tactics ran into the Mad Minute. Thanks for watching, hope you enjoyed this episode of the War Room. It was a little bit more of an overview, been focusing a bit more on general trends rather than specific details, but we should be able to get right down into the dirt for the next one.